People and our planet face multiple and interrelated threats. In this next session, we'll discuss how sustainable development requires a systems approach that builds multi-shock resilience.
Welcome to our session on understanding risk and reimagining resilience for a sustainable future. My name is Dr. Rebecca Nadin, and I'm the Director of Global Risks and Resilience at the ODI. We're partnering today with the United Nations as part of the SDG Action Zone 2020 to host today's event, bringing together our global community along with some distinguished speakers. So let me start by introducing them. We have Philippine Kedula, founder and director of the NGO Jitokezi wa Mama wa Africa, Barbara Guthrie, UL Vice President, Corporate Sustainability and UL Corporate Fellow, and Ayman Cherkaoui, Lead Counsel for Climate Change at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law and Strategic Development Officer at the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection. Welcome to you all. So we're here today to discuss if our current approaches to managing the threats and hazards of today are adequately preparing us for the challenges of tomorrow. So why is this so important? Don't we already have enough to worry about? We're already dealing with environmental degradation, including climate change, pandemics, increasing economic instability, conflict and organized crime, cyber disruption and disinformation, and a world in which our own responses to these events are generating feedback loops and creating new and emerging risks. These threats are not new to us, nor their impacts so unpredictable. In 2015, actually, Bill Gates warned us that we're not ready for the next pandemic. But reflecting too much via the lens of hindsight does not actually help us move forward. And it's not just about acknowledging these threats, but also building policy, legislative, and governance systems that can adapt to the changing nature and characteristics of these 21st century threats. These threats are not just interconnected, they're transboundary, they're transitional, they're shifting socioeconomic, technological, and environmental systems as we respond. They're transformational with the potential, as we've seen with the COVID-19 response, radically able to change societies and ecosystems and alter the status quo. And most importantly, they're occurring simultaneously in individual countries and across regions where the rate, frequency, and intensity is also rapidly changing. Governments and systems are facing a 21st century landscape that requires us to urgently reimagine our approach to resilience. But we're human, and it's easy to get overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. The complexity, that politically, socially, and financially is vast, which is perhaps why traditional approaches to managing risk often look at one threat at a time or in silos. But perhaps actually we need to start thinking a little bit more about building multi-shock or systems resilience to enable us to move towards a more risk-informed development approach, which is what today's event is all about. So we're going to start with a short video to put some of this thinking into pictures. And before then, I move to the panel. To my distinguished panelists, I want to start by thinking a little bit more about what we mean by building systems resilience. So building systems resilience and becoming more risk informed quite clearly is easier said than done. We've made a start. We have already the 17 SDG goals, and we have conventions such as the Sendai framework that seek to address many of those underlying drivers of vulnerability to many of these threats. But I want to start by asking you guys, from your perspective, is this enough? What do we need to do more of or do differently to respond to these multiple and interconnected threats? And I'd like to sort of turn to Barbara first to kind of get her perspective from the corporate angle.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. UL is an organization that has been around for 126 years. So we have definitely seen over a century of different risks and different threats. We're a mission-driven company with a purpose. We work for a safer world, and we've had that mission for over 126 years. What's interesting is our mission, our purpose has remained the same. Our processes, our workflows, our approach, our mitigation techniques have remained the same. What constantly changes and what evolves rather are the associated risks. So as UL has looked to addressing these risks, we see today they are probably believed to be more complicated, more complex than ever. But do we really understand them? And it's in the understanding that we break down that complexity. Back in the late 1800s, fire and electricity were the risks that UL had to approach. And we had to find a way to address those to keep society moving forward. Our founder, William Henry Merrill, had a motto that we live by today. Fire is servant, not master. And this is interesting because you can really apply this to any risk that one faces, whether it be fire and electricity, whether it be renewable energies, artificial intelligence, the coronavirus. Is it a servant to us, or are we the master of it? And in looking at the master, we then break it down. We look at the science. We look at common denominators, similarities, differences, interdependencies. We look for a systematic, holistic approach to resolve it. Over history, we can't simply ignore one hazard as we approach the next. We have to understand how they all work together, and we will not sacrifice one for the other. For example, when we look at how to address electricity, we wanted to move forward, yet we have to understand the impact it has on the economics, on society, on the workforce. Basically, I think as Rebecca said, as human nature, we don't look to boil the ocean. We shy away from it, but this really isn't an excuse for us or a reason. What's most importantly is that it narrows our focus too much. And in narrowing the focus, we shy away from the impact it has on other risks and threats. So instead of looking at shying away from it, we have to look from the top, look down, look to our history. UL has continued to thrive and survive in world wars, in the recession, in the depression, in different consumer, industrial, political movements. We address both technological threats, risks, as well as those that we've approached as both humans as we are today. And we look to those threats holistically, systematically as a single ecosystem. And that way we can resolve and move forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara. I think that segues quite nicely actually into sort of Ayman, your kind of take on what we need to be perhaps doing differently. How do we respond to these from, let's think about the sort of the legislative space.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this excellent question. Thank you for this opportunity to engage and discuss this very timely topic. Thank you as well to Barbara for her very pertinent and relevant comments. Indeed, as you said, it segues quite well to some elements I want to bring to our collective attention. But first, we'd like to start with quoting you, Rebecca. You were saying earlier that the risks we would need to address, mitigate, and manage would be in nature, transboundary, transitional, shifting systems, as well as transformational and simultaneous. As such, the solutions to those risks and how we approach them must also check all those marks. I think it's very important and critical that we do so. Evidently, it's very much an all hands on deck approach that is needed. All sectors, I'm happy to be speaking after a representative of the private sector. Entrepreneurship is very important. Bringing this kind of dynamism and perspective is also very, very critical. And importantly, just like the private sector, civil society as a whole, NGOs, activists, youth, we saw how successful and how important the voice of youth has been over the last few years in bringing issues such as climate change to the forefront of our considerations. I think it's very important to also keep that in mind. Having said that, I would like to also, while expressing support, also caution against a sentence we use a lot in our space, is bring the right people to the room, right? How we need to make sure that the right people are in the room. And while I think it's an important concept, I have two issues with that. First, is there really such a thing as the wrong kind of people? I think really everybody has an important role to play in bringing part to the solution that we need to define and implement when it comes to managing those type of risks and addressing them. The second type is really, and sorry for being a bit too down to earth in my interpretation of that expression, but it's the proverbial room. I have a bit of an issue about that because I find that there's always the risk of bringing those people in the room and having that room disconnected from what needs to happen at the local level and on the ground. And really, unfortunately, as we are aware, this is a risk that has come true, that has realized itself, unfortunately, in quite a few spaces over the years. So I'd like to say that I'd very much like the room to be full of windows and very, very open windows so that we can collaborate, but more importantly, keep this connection and with what's happening in the broader space, I think would be very, very critical and very important. And lastly, still on this very room, it's not just about bringing those people in this very open and well ventilated room, but it's also making sure that there are actions that come out of that room. And I'm happy to be speaking in the context of this SDG action zone, because really it is not about the so-called right kind of people patting themselves in the back about being in the room, but it's really about what comes out of bringing all this kind of people in this inclusive manner in a space where concrete action can arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayman. And I think that also leads us well to Philippine now, to really sort of think about the local level. So for many countries, as we've heard, these threats, it's not new, and also dealing with pandemics, dealing with disease for many countries is not new. It might be new for many European countries, but certainly in many parts of the world, sadly, this is business as usual. So I just wanted to hear from you, sort of, what do we need to be doing more at the local level? How can we do things differently to enable communities to cope with issues such as pandemics, climate change, conflict, economic instability, all these things that are happening kind of simultaneously for many people?
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Bob, for your contribution, and Ayman also for yours. Just like Ayman quoted you, I would like to piggy from something that he said on the last statement about the room, keeping it really like well lit with a lot of windows. So with the work that I do here in Africa, a lot of our meetings still happen under a tree. It's like community level, very open, very inviting. It doesn't restrict. And in a way, I feel as if when I think about how I've engaged the work of, especially when it comes to international treaties, like for example, the Paris Agreement, you're talking about the CEDAW agreement as well. All these are such like high level agreements that a lot of people on the ground don't even know about. They don't know. And these agreements, they need to be part of the decisions that are made that go into these agreements. Beyond that, they need to be the ones that are invested in to implement them, right? And so I feel like one of the most important things to do is to actually have it be more inclusive before these agreements happen, the work needs to be done on the ground and have them be part of the dialogue that is going on wherever it is at the high level. It's so important. And when I think about risks, like you're saying, like many of us have been living through it. It's our history in Africa, especially. Even here in my community, last year, like I think the last 2 years, we've been struggling with after a severe drought, we went into really prolonged floods. And now we are dealing with landslides, we are dealing with COVID, and it's September, we are supposed to be harvesting our crop. Most of our farmers have lost their crop because of extreme floods, right? Red Cross is now working to resettle some families. And so this is like a reality for us. And for us, it's important for when we work with the local people to think about locally available assets and resources and capacities, because disasters and these risks happen sometimes without much prediction, right? And even droughts, some of these predictions that we follow, for example, with the meteorological department, some of them are incorrect. Like now they told us we were supposed to have dry season beginning the early of August. Now we're in September, we are still having extreme floods, right? And so it's so important that there's such a strong need for adaptability at the very local level that is also informed by data, like data that scientists work with, social scientists work with. This data needs to also support the decisions that farmers make, women make, you know. So this is like one very important thing. And I'm also thinking about another factor that I'm finding to be such a great risk for us as we work here, especially with women, is the problem of illiteracy. I work for empowerment, women empowerment, and a lot of our work is targeted on improving livelihoods. So we do training on micro businesses, savings and loaning programs, and then we train them also to connect with markets and establish like value chains that are strong, and they become involved in all the sectors of the value chain, right? But do you know, this is intended to help them to have the economic means also to anticipate risk. One of the issues is that, but also to improve their socioeconomic status, right? But it's turning out that one of the greatest risks we are dealing with is really illiteracy. About 65% of women I work with are illiterate. And so when I think too about, we are supporting the women to also do savings and loaning programs, and they are saving their money in like the phone. And we are thinking about some of the people that have been defrauding people on the phone. And you can imagine when you're illiterate, you're not aware about how fraudsters work, how much you can lose. And sometimes this phone saves money for like 13 members of one self-help group, for example, or sometimes it goes in even up to 40. And this would be savings that would take them for like 6 months of loaning and growing the savings for the businesses to grow. So imagine if they lost all of that just because somebody was not literate enough to get the information they need to know how to deal with such kind of problems. So this is like one big issue. And now in Kenya right now with the COVID situation, another risk factor is coming out that I feel international community kind of needs to be strong in dealing with, is the issue of corruption and the draining of funds out of the country by political leaders, presidents, and you know, all their the elite politicians around them, and businesses. Some of them you don't even see the face, but you just know the system exists, like cartels. They are really strangling the economy of Kenya, and it's a problem. Like for example, we are since Kenya recorded the first case of COVID in March 17th, every day the government has been taking a loan of about 4.3 billion every day up to today to deal with the COVID crisis. And none of that money has really reached the people on the ground. All of that money is stolen through corruption and into Swiss banks and Cayman Islands. Yeah. This to me is like, I feel as if we deal with this risk, it would be like a really great step ahead, but we cannot just deal with that and then ignore the woman who doesn't know how to read and write. We cannot just deal with that risk and ignore the woman who is afraid to go to the hospital because she has signs of malaria, but she's afraid maybe they will say she has COVID and she will be stuck there, you know? So it's so all round that we need to take the approach of the old African value where everything needs to be seen as interconnected and interdependent. And so we, like who we bring to the room or the discussion need to come from all sectors of our society and to bring their knowledge, their skills, and together we can come up with ways of addressing the problem and the risks that we face. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Philippine. No, I think that is so true. And you've highlighted there a number of areas such as illiteracy, which actually building the resilience to a whole range of threats, whether it's cybercrime, whether it's managing health, public health, can be addressed through something such as literacy. And actually, I think it's about acknowledging that often those who must bear the risks are not those whose voices are heard in how better to manage those risks. And that's something that we really need to be addressing if we're trying to build a more interconnected approach, systems resilience approach. I want to move us now to another aspect of building resilience, which we've sort of touched on a little bit, but that also means understanding trade-offs. So no matter how well targeted our actions and interventions are designed to respond to specific threats, there's always going to be trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs. There's always going to be opportunities, winners and losers. And if we take, of course, the kind of global or national responses to COVID-19, I think we can see quite clearly there that there are a number of trade-offs. And I kind of want to start with Ayman, kind of from the climate change angle. So in the case of climate change, do you think COVID-19 response has kind of accelerated or hampered sort of policy or legislative responses to that?
Thank you, Rebecca, for this question. This actually, as I'm sure you're aware, quite recently the UN system released a United in Science report that addresses this particular, well, not quite as broadly, but addresses the science and provides elements of answer from a scientific perspective as for the link between COVID-19 and climate. And I would like to, from that report, extract two elements. The first of them being a quote from the United Nations Secretary General that in the foreword says that COVID-19 and the pandemic has impacted, disrupted many lives across the planet. At the same time, the heating of our planet and climate disruption have continued apace. And I think it's quite important that we really understand that. I invite you to read the report, it's quite interesting. And there's a number of key messages. And the second thing I wanted to do was to extract two of the key messages that I believe are quite relevant to address the question you fielded. The first of them being the fact that while there is a reduction in emissions anticipated for 2020 of between 4 to 7% compared to 2019, there is no reduction expected when it comes to the concentration of CO2 gas emitted. I think this is very important to understand, to separate between the two, and understand that the reduction in the emissions compared to last year still does not translate into a reduction in terms of concentration when it comes to the emission of greenhouse gases. The second thing I wanted to, in the same spirit, extract as a key message from that report was linked to, notwithstanding that expected reduction, the 5-year period between 2016 to 2020 is still to be the warmest 5-year period in record. So having set that bit of a scene, I think it's important to understand that we need to shift the narrative. If I were to use the shift language that you introduced earlier, and beyond the narrative, really the system, because while there may be some trade-offs in terms of short-term planning, clearly, when you look at climate change from a longer term perspective, it becomes almost de facto trade-offs in everything not to address climate change would be the message I would like to share with you. And lastly, earlier you were asking me about the legislative aspect, and clearly, whether it is law or governance, both can play a role in either hampering or fostering climate action, and being actors in either facilitating the positive, sustainable transformation we ought to see, or on the other hand, could be breaks in terms of how we envision that. And I think quite critically, it's important that we work all together to make sure that law and governance are leveraged in a way that is inclusive, has a positive impact, that is sustainable, and leaves no one behind. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ayman. Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point about really leveraging that law and governance together. And I think that also touches on some of the issues that Philippine was highlighting. So Philippine, again, turning to you, you did sort of touch on some of these points in your earlier intervention, but if I could just ask you for a little more detail, as we know, countries are facing number of challenges, and you've highlighted some of those within your own context, and we've seen a huge shift by development actors and donors really focusing on COVID-19. It's kind of that's all anyone can kind of talk about at the moment. Do you think that focus is overshadowing or distracting a bit from other equally important issues? You mentioned a few before, issues of corruption, issues of women's education and empowerment. But I wondered, if you could send a message to the development community, what would it be?
Definitely, I have seen that shift, especially in the allocation of funds, not just with the donors and the development community, but also with the national government. There has been such a great shift in the way funding has been aligned, and a lot of it has been taken out from sustaining sectors like the education sector, for example. Because of COVID, schools had to close, right? But instead of reinvesting that funding to make learning, probably adapting the learning to the fact that the kids don't have to go to school, but they can use other strategies, like, for example, the internet, making it even more available, making computers more available, or sending out like satellite teachers. Up to today, teachers haven't been funded to go and support this kind of education. And Kenya's problem with illiteracy is such a big problem, and dropping out of school and all that. And it's because funding was taken out from the education sector and it was put into the COVID, the kitty for COVID. And this is a problem too, like even with some of our donors, there was a realignment of funding. So to me, it really is a problem, because also of the fact that with development, it's such a slow process, especially working with like very rural communities where it takes a long time to enculturate them to accept policies, for example, or to train them on steps of engaging policy, for example. Once you lose a whole year, which is what has happened to us, the funding has really shifted. A whole year has been lost, and the focus has been on responding to COVID. Next year, once we resume to do the work we were doing, it will be like we've lost so much that we would probably be going back 2 years, and so it's really a big problem. And it's also has affected the health sector. Yes, we have COVID happening, but funding supporting, for example, malaria treatment has reduced, response to issues like TB, for example, that the funding for that has gone up a bit. So I don't really understand how the donors are making these decisions, but to me it seems like they needed to have locked that instead of doing reallocation. And so yeah, it's just like I feel as if like the way we normally deal with droughts and landslides in our organization, that is just one of the risks that we know affects our long-term goal of social change and economic change. It's just one aspect of it, and we always have to anticipate it, but run it under the ongoing program. And so that's how I feel it needed to have been done with COVID. Staff needed to have been supported, or organizations needed to have been supported to kind of adapt their norm to reduce the risk of infection, but not to completely stop their activities. And so I have seen that the trade-off here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Philippine. Yes, I think that's an important point, because what we need to avoid is where the prioritization of one risk is at the detriment of others. And this is really about, when we talk about hearing from others and stakeholder engagement and participatory approaches in the development space, actually that really does mean that we need to be talking to people at the community level, like yourselves, Philippine, and your NGO, and really hear what are the priorities, what are the risks and priorities that are being faced on the ground. So it's about really recognizing that our own risk priorities might not be the same as other people's. Moving now to oh, sorry, go ahead.
And two, I feel as if I may add another point, is to consider the fact of preparedness for some of these risks needs to also know, we also need to know that the work we've been doing, for example, in investing, let's say, for example, for people working in the slums, investing for their resilience really is part of the process of reducing the risk of the spread of COVID, And so giving up on or slowing down that process really increases the spread of COVID, because people are using extreme coping mechanisms to actually get something to eat. Whereas in the past, if they were running these development programs, they would have something to get them by, that they don't have to be so extreme. And so the risk of spreading the infection of COVID would not have been as high. And so this is, to me, is we need to understand that the interrelatedness, and kind of respect that very sensitive connection that exists there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Absolutely. And which is, I suppose, what we're trying to kind of send the message out from today's event. Barbara, moving to you now. I mean, when we talk of trade-offs, one of the perhaps most obvious ones from the public health response to, or the governments across the world response to COVID, has been the impact on the economy. We're now seeing, governments around the world focusing jobs growth. Does that mean, do you think, from sort of industry business perspective, do you see the ambitions for driving forward sustainability agendas and delivering on some of the SDG commitments from a corporate industry perspective? Do you see those taking a back seat to the bottom line being the most important agenda item for the C-suite?
I really see it as quite the opposite. In fact, that's the way UL is approaching it. And that's part of the optimism in me. That's also the realism in me. I mean, sustainability is about resilience. It's about the test of time. Over these past few months, it really amazes me all we've gone through: the pandemic, social injustice, unheard of weather conditions. What it took to pull this off alone. And yet here we are all talking. We are resilient as human beings, which means we're sustainable as human beings. And as businesses, as governments, as industries, we also have to look at this as learning and moving on. I don't think of these situations as or decisions. And I think that's really important. It's not a sacrifice of one for the other. It's not a trade-off. They must be and decisions. They must coexist. We had a situation that we've been going through at UL. from the technological side, but again, it's all different forms of threats and risks, and how do we then adapt those to the risks that we're dealing with. For a long time, we understood the importance of flame retardants in furniture and children's clothing and in our bedding, flame retardants that then prevented flames and deaths. More recently, because of the information, long-term data, we understand there can be ill adverse health effects with flame retardants. So now you all had to consider, does that mean we get rid of flame retardants because we want to have the best of human health?
Yeah.
Well, then we're back to the original hazard of people potentially dying in their homes. So no, it's not an or, it's not a sacrifice or a trade-off or one for the other. It's being able to find the solution to the ands. And I think that's so often what we often lose sight of. On this call, so many of us have talked about that systematic approach, the ecosystem approach. Everything in nature, in our lives, in the business economies, piggyback and play off of one another. They're interconnected, independent. To separate them is to really sell ourselves short with what we're approaching. So we have to maintain that systematic approach. Do not sacrifice one risk for the other. Do not over prioritize, but learn, adapt, and build upon one another. Again, there is so many things we have accomplished. Again, just all of us being here today with all that's going on, and we realize we can do it. We just have to put our minds to it, put our minds together to do it, recognize what's being done in all the different parts of the world, and move forward. Again, it is not our master. We are the master. It will be the servant to us.
Thank you, Barbara. And that sort of leads down to my sort of kind of final ask of you guys. I mean, you touched on it a bit, Barbara, and as of others, you know, the challenge ahead, sort of delivering the SDGs, building a sustainable future, navigating all the kind of scientific and political and financial uncertainty. I mean, you know, it's a daunting task, isn't it? But I think, you know, history and what you say kind of brings this to my mind, Barbara, is that history has taught us it's not always the specific crisis that defines us, but how we respond to it, isn't it? So my last question to each one of you, and I sort of need a sort of 30-second kind of soundbite response. What leaves you optimistic about the road ahead? And maybe Philippine, I go to you first.
Well, I'm very optimistic because of how I see the young people in our community are engaging issues. They are so much more open and so much more creative. And so even with the issue of illiteracy, they're engaging social media in ways that I feel is kind of making information more accessible even to those who are illiterate on the ground. And so the youth leave me hopeful. And the youth, they are among the ones we consider to be so much more vulnerable. But the fact that they are acting positively to me shows that we have like a group that we can rely on to pass on the baton, you know, and to continue, because this journey is like, I think it's our whole lifetime's journey, you know, and so they give me hope.
That. Thank you. And now moving on to Barbara. You're as you say, you're an optimist, you know, by default. So, but just keen to kind of hear your thoughts.
And an optimist yet a realist, and that's an important blend. And I think about this is all about truly this what we're calling Action Week, the Action Zone, and the SDGs. And when you think of the SDGs, I want to remind us how interconnected and interdependent they are of one another. We look at them and we see 17 different colors. We see 17 different icons. We see a multitude of indicators, of goals, of targets that we have to meet. And it's daunting, as you said, Rebecca. It's daunting, it's overwhelming. And but we have to remember they all interconnect. Where you impact one, you impact a multitude of others. And then I look at SDG number 17, and that's our call to action. That is where it says we all, as people, as beings, as friends of one another, need to also be interdependent to each other and interconnected and work together to solve those, because that's what's going to make the world a better place.
Thank you. Yeah, we perhaps need to do a bit more promotion of SDG 17. I sometimes feel like it's the forgotten one, and actually it's the hook that it holds it all together, really.
I think it's always the glue. That's what
that's it, exactly. And Ayman, always the optimist too, my dear friend.
Thank you. Yes, happy to be optimistic indeed. I think it's quite important, for them also in these challenging times. But I guess I will react in two points. The first of them is having spent a few years studying engineering, whenever I see a complex issue, I believe there's simplicity in that waiting to be unearthed. So I do fully agree with you, Rebecca, that it's daunting when you look at the challenge, it's daunting when you look at the complexity, but there is simplicity that can be teased out of that complexity. I think it's important to keep in mind. And secondly, I guess I would go full loop, going back at the title of the event, Reimagining Risk and Resilience for a Global Future. We talked a lot about risk and resilience, not as much about imagination. And I have tremendous faith in our individual and collective capacity to imagine and act on a better future for all of us. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ayman. Yeah, and that reminds me, I think, of a quote by Einstein, I think, about, we can only change our world by kind of changing our thinking, and that's what needs to happen. And that, as you've all highlighted, from youth, from innovation, creativity and imagination, that's what humankind can pull together. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you today for taking part in the panel discussion. I think we could have easily carried on a bit longer, but time is up. I want to thank you everybody as well for joining us online, and particular thanks to the SDG Action Zone and Her Excellency Amina Mohammed for inviting ODI to host today's event. ODI is also launching a report today that actually looks at some of these intersecting threats and different responses in Myanmar and Niger. But I want to leave by just saying to everyone a huge thanks, and most of all, stay safe, stay strong, but also stay hopeful.